Welcome everybody. This is the man behind God is Dead. Let's begin.
God is dead. Three words that shook the foundations of Western thought. But who was the man who dared to write them? Not a priest, not a prophet, not even a politician, but a lonely philosopher battling sickness, heartbreak, and his own mind. This is the story of Friedrich Nietzsche, a man who rose from a quiet village in Germany, walked beside kings of art and music, and ended his days in silence, yet left behind words so powerful they still haunt us today. Tonight we trace the life, the loves, and the madness of the man behind God is Dead. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a small village called Recurrence, Germany. His father was a Lutheran pastor, and the boy was named after King Friedrich Wilhelm IV. It was a childhood touched by faith and tragedy. When Friedrich was only 4, his father died from a brain illness. Soon after, his younger brother passed away as well. The family moved, the house grew quieter, and the child began to retreat into books and music. He was gifted, almost unnaturally so. By the age of 10, Nietzsche was composing music, and by his teens he was writing poetry that carried a weight far beyond his years. At school, he earned the nickname the Little Pastor because of his seriousness and sharp mind. But he was not destined for the pulpit. Instead, the young Nietzsche immersed himself in the study of Greek and Roman classics. He became fascinated by tragedy, myth, and the old gods, the stories that spoke of human suffering and heroism. By 24, he had done the impossible. He was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, one of the youngest in Europe. A brilliant academic future stretched out before him. But the life of a scholar was only the beginning. For Nietzsche, words on a page were never enough. He was searching for something greater. A music of ideas, a philosophy that could shake the soul. And soon, he would find a man who promised exactly that. Nietzsche's early years were marked not only by grief, but by an unusual inner discipline. While other boys played, he filled notebooks with music notation and fragments of thought. Even his teachers confessed they had rarely seen such intensity in one so young. There was a sense that his mind was already older than his body, a seriousness that set him apart and left him both admired and isolated. When Nietzsche arrived in Basel, he carried the aura of a prodigy. But behind his scholarly achievements was a hunger for something beyond dusty manuscripts. That hunger found its match in music. Richard Wagner, the titan of German opera, was at that time the living embodiment of artistic power. His works were thunder and lightning, a storm of myth and melody that seemed to carry the entire destiny of a nation. Nietzsche was captivated. In Wagner, he saw more than a composer. He saw a prophet of art, a man who could awaken the German spirit and replace old religion with new beauty. The two men met, and a strange friendship was born. Wagner, decades older, treated Nietzsche as a brilliant disciple. Nietzsche, in turn, felt as if he had finally found the father figure he had lost so young. At Wanfried, Wagner's villa, Nietzsche experienced a world of culture, music, and intellectual excitement unlike anything he had known. He believed he had found in Wagner the artistic savior who could redeem mankind. In 1872, Nietzsche published The Birth of Tragedy. It was his first major work, and it carried Wagner's fingerprints all over it. In the book, Nietzsche argued that Greek tragedy, born from the tension between the wild, emotional Dionysus and the ordered, rational Apollo, represented the highest form of art. And he believed Wagner's music was the modern heir to that spirit. For a moment, Nietzsche stood at the center of a cultural revolution. But it would not last, because behind Wagner's grandeur, Nietzsche began to sense something darker. Ego, nationalism, and a creeping return of the very moralism he had hoped art would replace. At Wanfried, Wagner's villa in Bayreuth, Nietzsche witnessed evenings that felt like rituals. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, music spilled from the piano, and conversations about myth and destiny carried late into the night. For Nietzsche, it was intoxicating, an entire world built around the promise that art could heal the sickness of modern culture. He left those gatherings not only inspired, but convinced. He was walking beside a man who would change the future. The dream of art was about to turn into disillusion. At first, Nietzsche saw Wagner as the future, but the dream began to crack. Wagner's music, once a storm of myth and ecstasy, started to feel to Nietzsche like something else. A cult of personality, heavy with nationalism, and tainted with the shadow of Christianity he thought he had escaped. The man who had promised liberation now seemed to be building another kind of prison. The breaking point came with Wagner's opera Parsifal. It was drenched in Christian symbolism, celebrating faith and redemption. To Nietzsche, this was betrayal. He had placed his hopes in art as the new God, and now his God was kneeling before the old one. Inhuman, All Too Human, published in 1878. Nietzsche began cutting ties with the Wagnerian dream. It was a book of aphorisms, sharp as broken glass, attacking illusions, religion, even art itself. Many readers were shocked. The young disciple of Wagner was gone. In his place stood a thinker who dared to question everything. The cost was isolation. Nietzsche's health collapsed, forcing him to leave his professorship. For the rest of his life he wandered Europe, living in boarding houses, small rented rooms, chasing clean air and silence for his fragile body. But the solitude gave him something else: freedom. Out of pain and loneliness came a new voice, Nietzsche's own. In books like The Dawn and The Gay Science, he announced ideas that would shake the modern world: the death of God, the revaluation of values, and the birth of a philosophy that stared into the abyss without fear. The friendship with Wagner had begun as worship. It ended as a warning. No man, no music, no myth could carry the burden of truth for him. From now on, Nietzsche would walk alone. The break was not just intellectual, it was personal. Nietzsche had invested his hope, his loyalty, even a kind of love in Wagner. To see that hope collapse left him with bitterness and a hollow ache. His letters from these years speak of exhaustion, loneliness, and the constant fight with migraines, nausea, and failing eyesight. Each day was a negotiation with pain. And yet from that same weakness he drew the strength to think with new sharpness. He was learning, in the hardest way possible, that philosophy must be written not from comfort, but from the edge of survival. In the midst of his solitude, Nietzsche encountered a woman who seemed to carry the spark of everything he longed for. Her name was Lou Andreas-Salomé. She was brilliant, magnetic, and fiercely independent. A woman who could move with ease through the world of ideas, challenging men on equal ground, refusing to play the roles expected of her. For Nietzsche, meeting her was like finding a mirror that finally looked back. He imagined a future where they could join forces, not only as companions, but as allies in the battle for truth. In letters and in conversation, he poured out his hope. Perhaps with Lou, he could overcome the loneliness that had haunted him since youth. But Lou did not return his love. To her, Nietzsche was a fascinating mind, a man to respect and even admire, but not the partner she desired. When she refused his proposal, the rejection cut deep. Worse still, the tangled relationships around Lou brought jealousy and humiliation into Nietzsche's life. Friends drifted away, alliances collapsed, and Nietzsche found himself more isolated than ever. The heartbreak was not just personal. It reshaped his philosophy. In the wound of rejection, he found new language for suffering, new metaphors for strength and survival. He began to speak of amor fati, the love of fate, not as a gentle acceptance, but as the demand to embrace even the pain that crushes us. Lou would go on to become a psychoanalyst, a student of Freud, and a writer in her own right. But for Nietzsche, she remained the great lost possibility, the love that never was. and the ghost that pushed him deeper into solitude, deeper into himself. Yet the memory of Lou did not vanish. Years later, in fragments of his notebooks, Nietzsche wrote lines that carried her shadow. Words about longing, pride, and the cruel distance between minds that cannot unite. Some scholars would later argue that without Lou, there would be no Zarathustra, no fierce solitude in which his greatest work was born. Her absence became a presence, an invisible thread woven through his most powerful books. In the hush of rented rooms and mountain pensions, with migraines like knives and eyesight failing, Nietzsche began to write as if a storm had moved into his chest and refused to leave. What came out was not a textbook or a lecture, it was a vision. A wanderer stepped onto the page, a prophet who had lived above the villages for 10 years, returning to speak in parables and thunder. His name was Zarathustra, and through him Nietzsche stopped arguing and started proclaiming, "God is dead." The line lands like a bell struck at midnight, but Nietzsche did not mean a murder scene, he meant a diagnosis. The old ceiling of belief, the heavens that once held together morality, meaning, purpose, had cracked. Science advanced, faith retreated, and people kept repeating the words of inherited virtues without the heartbeat that once gave them life. If the old center is gone, what now? Nothingness is one answer, nihilism, the feeling that life is empty, that values are costumes and truth a polite fiction. Nietzsche saw this coming and he hated it, not with the bitterness of a cynic, but with the alarm of a doctor who knows the patient will die if we don't act. So he prescribed something dangerous, revaluation, the courage to examine the tables of good and evil and ask who wrote them, and why. Herd morality, he says, is safe, built to keep everyone low and level, and it breeds resentment, the quiet poison of people who feel weak and call their weakness virtue. Against this, he dares to imagine a different posture, not cruelty, not domination for its own sake, but a higher form of strength, the energy to shape a life actively, creatively, joyfully. This is where the most misunderstood word enters, Übermensch, not a cartoon tyrant, but a human being who overcomes, who outgrows the need to borrow meaning and instead forges it, like heat shaping iron. Become who you are, he writes, a sentence that sounds simple until you try to do it. Zarathustra speaks not in footnotes but in images, the tightrope walker who falls because the crowd loves a fall, the three metamorphoses of the spirit, the camel who bears, the lion who says no to the dragon of thou shalt, and the child who says a sacred yes and begins to create. It's a map of transformation disguised as myth. And when he says, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star, he is not celebrating disorder, he is insisting that creation costs something, that new light is born out of risk and trembling. Then comes the riddle that tests your pulse, the eternal recurrence. Imagine that a demon whispers to you, this life, every pain, every joy, every small embarrassment, and every secret triumph must return again and again, infinitely. Would you curse the demon, or would you turn and say, you are God, and never did I hear anything more divine? The thought experiment is a mirror. Do you live in a way you could affirm eternally, or are you surviving a script you would refuse if you were free? Nietzsche wants philosophy to be a pressure test, not a lullaby. And under all this, sometimes shouted, sometimes humming like a low note, is will to power. Not politics, not domination over others as a program, but the inner drive of life to expand, to interpret, to overcome resistance and realize form. Plants bend toward light, artists bend chaos toward shape, the self, if it is awake, bends fate toward meaning. This is why he returns to a strange kind of love, a more fatty love of one's fate. Not resignation, affirmation. To say yes not only to the honey, but to the sting, not only to victory, but to the training that tore your muscles to threads. If you can bless your scars, you can wear them as armor, and then nothing is only loss. Zarathustra's voice is severe, but listen closely and you will hear something like laughter. Not the laughter of mockery, the laughter of lightness after a long war within. For Nietzsche, cheerfulness is not naive, it is earned, what remains when illusion burns and you are still able to dance. He opposes the spirit of heaviness, the gravity that makes every duty grim, with a different gravity, the pull of creation. What is great in man, he says, is that he is a bridge and not a goal. We are on the way, and that is not a curse, but a calling. Critics accused him of tearing down morality. He believed he was tearing down idols. He wasn't asking you to become heartless, he was asking you to become honest, to separate pity from performance, obedience from fear, virtue from the need to be seen as virtuous. He distrusted the last men, those comfortable souls who prefer safety to depth and call it progress. Better, he thinks, to risk the mountain path and breathe thin air, than to sleep forever in the valley and dream someone else's dream. All the while, his body is failing, attacks of pain, nausea, blinding light behind the eyes. The sentences sharpen as the nerves fray. In the gay science, he writes of dancing and danger, of artists and free spirits, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he pours the same fire into parable, and beyond good and evil, he dismantles the furniture of inherited thought and asks us to sit on the floor and feel the ground again. It is philosophy done with a sculptor's hammer, tap, 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 and sometimes a clean strike. If you want the simplest key, Nietzsche wants you awake. Awake to the sources of what you believe, awake to the possibility that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to say yes in its presence, awake to the work of shaping a self that is not a copy. He is not a safe companion, he does not promise comfort, and he laughs at every shortcut, but he walks beside you toward the edge where life stops being theory and starts being a decision. Out of solitude came a book that sounded like thunder. And the storm had not passed. Ahead lay a final blaze, a year of books written at a fever pitch, a swan song before the silence. 1888, the year Nietzsche became fire. His health was collapsing, his nerves burned with pain, his eyesight blurred, his stomach rebelled against food, yet his mind was incandescent. In a single year, a torrent of words poured out of him, books that read not like philosophy in the old style, but like hammers striking stone, like thunderclaps over a sick earth. The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, each one written as if there would never be another tomorrow, as if he knew that the end was coming. He had left behind the professor's desk, the lecture hall, the cautious footnotes, now every line struck like a verdict. In Twilight of the Idols, he declared war on the false comforts of culture, on moral codes that numbed instead of strengthened. "What does not kill me makes me stronger," he wrote. Today it's quoted on posters and in gyms, but for Nietzsche it was no cliché. It was testimony, the raw truth of a man who had been broken again and again by illness, by isolation, by heartbreak, and had somehow emerged sharper, harder, stranger. Then came the Antichrist, the most explosive of them all. Here he took Christianity and turned it inside out. Not the figure of Jesus, whom he sometimes admired as a tragic rebel, but the church that had, in his eyes, betrayed life. He called it the triumph of resentment, of weakness turned into virtue, of guilt and submission elevated as holiness. His words dripped acid. The Christian church has left nothing untouched by its corruption. It has made every value worthless, every truth a lie. For Nietzsche, it was not mere attack, it was surgery, to cut away what he believed was killing the vitality of Europe. And then, almost unbelievably, Ecce Homo, behold the man. An autobiography like no other, half confession, half performance, half prophecy. He wrote chapters with titles like Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books. Some readers thought it was madness, others saw irony, some saw both. It was as if Nietzsche, standing on the brink of collapse, decided to write his own legend with a trembling smile. Ecce Homo was more than arrogance, it was performance art, philosophy disguised as theater. In those bizarre chapter titles, Why I Am So Wise, Why I Write Such Good Books, Nietzsche was mocking the very idea of autobiography. He was laughing at himself and at the genre, creating a mask that revealed more than it hid. Some passages feel almost tender, others manic, but together they form the self-portrait of a man who wanted to decide how history would remember him. He praised his own works, dissected his own life, and in between the strange laughter you can hear a man facing death with a kind of theatrical defiance. He was no longer pleading to be understood, he was inscribing himself into eternity. And all of this while living alone, in small rooms, often too weak to walk outside, with neighbors whispering about the eccentric lodger who never stopped writing. Imagine the scene, a thin figure bent over a desk, the oil lamp trembling, piles of manuscripts rising around him, the sound of the pen scratching at fever pace, faster, faster, as if he had to outrun the silence that was already closing in. He wrote as though time itself were a predator at his back, chasing him across the page. Neighbors later recalled hearing the scratch of his pen at all hours, relentless, like a man possessed. He slept little, ate almost nothing, and yet the words came faster than his body could endure. Each manuscript seemed torn out of him, as if silence would swallow him whole if he stopped for even a moment. In one fragment from this period he wrote, "I am not a man, I am dynamite." He did not mean bombs and fire, he meant ideas, sentences, visions that could shatter centuries of illusion. He was convinced that his words would not matter in his lifetime, but someday, after the dust, people would hear the detonation. 1888 was his swan song, the final blaze before the night. In less than 12 months he had emptied himself onto the page, as if his body knew it was the last chance to speak. Each book was a flare in the darkness, each sentence carved like it might be his last. The fever, the laughter, the bitterness, the poetry, all of it fused together into a single year of genius, and beneath the fevered brilliance, there were cracks. Letters grew stranger, words bent under the pressure of his racing thoughts. Friends began to whisper that something was wrong. In every triumphant sentence there is the sound of exhaustion, a mind that had burned too brightly for too long. The swan song was not just brilliance, it was the sound of a vessel straining before it broke. And then, silence approached. Just weeks later, in the streets of Turin, the fire that had burned too brightly would break. The mind that had lit itself against the world would collapse into shadow. The dynamite had gone off, and now only the echo remained. January 1889. Turin. The streets are cold, alive with carriages and voices. Nietzsche walks alone, thin, exhausted, but still moving with the strange intensity of the swan song year behind him. And then it happens, the moment that has become legend. He sees a horse being whipped by its driver. Something inside him breaks. Nietzsche throws his arms around the animal's neck and collapses to the ground. Whether every detail of this scene is true or myth hardly matters. What is certain is that Nietzsche's mind shattered that day. From that moment forward, he would never write again. In the days that followed, his letters grew frantic, filled with grand declarations and strange signatures. In one he wrote, "I am the crucified," and another Dionysus against the crucified. At times he signed as Caesar, at times as the creator of the world itself. The voice that once cut with irony and clarity now spun out into fevered fragments. Some who read them saw blasphemy, others saw prophecy, but all knew the philosopher of Zarathustra was gone. His mother rushed to his side, bringing him home to Naumburg. Later his sister Elizabeth would take over his care in Weimar. Doctors argued endlessly: syphilis, a brain tumor, hereditary disease, simple exhaustion, no diagnosis was ever final. What remains is mystery. Perhaps it was the price of carrying too much thought in a body too frail to hold it. Perhaps it was something darker. In the end, the collapse became part of the myth, the philosopher of strength undone by weakness, the thinker of clarity swallowed by shadow. The final 11 years of Nietzsche's life unfolded in silence. Visitors described him sitting by a window, sometimes humming softly, sometimes stroking a piano though he could no longer play. Music, once his first love, had become nothing more than ghostly echoes under his fingers. On rare occasions a faint smile appeared, but more often he stared far away, as if the man who had written of eternal recurrence was already living elsewhere, beyond reach. And there was another tragedy woven into this silence. Elizabeth, his sister, became his caretaker and his editor. She staged Nietzsche as a kind of silent prophet, showing him to visitors while controlling the interpretation of his work. It was under her hand that his writings were twisted, censored, and later entangled with political ideologies he would have despised. Nietzsche was alive, but absent. His philosophy grew louder in Europe even as his own voice had fallen away. The years after Turin were not empty, they were heavy with a different kind of weight. Imagine a man once aflame with words, now reduced to a figure seated in silence while others spoke about him, around him, above him. Elizabeth displayed him like a relic, the mute prophet whose gaze had turned inward. Visitors traveled from across Europe to catch a glimpse, and some left shaken, not by what he said, but by what he no longer could. In Weimar, his sister's salon became a stage. She placed her brother in a chair as if he were part of the furniture of genius, a silent witness while she read from his works and promoted her own distorted version of his thought. Nietzsche sat still, sometimes rocking gently, sometimes lost in a world no one else could enter. His hair grew long, his eyes far away, his face pale and strangely childlike. There were moments, fleeting, fragile, when music stirred him. A piano melody could draw a faint hum from his lips, the ghost of the young boy who once dreamed of becoming a composer. But it was never more than a shadow of what he had been. The philosopher who had thundered against comfort and mediocrity had himself become the object of pity, frozen in a silence more tragic than death. For his readers, however, the silence was deceptive. In these very years his books began to find new life. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, ignored at first, started to circulate. The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, The Antichrist, works born in solitude now began to echo across Europe. Nietzsche was both absent and present, alive and already myth. The body was gone, but the words were only just beginning to rise. On August 25, 1900, Friedrich Nietzsche died, aged 55. His final years had been lived in twilight, a slow fading of the body, but not of the words he had already written. The storm had passed from his mind into his books, and there it would remain, waiting for the world that was still to come. Nietzsche died in 1900, but his words refused to die with him. In truth, they were only beginning their real life. Yet the afterlife of his philosophy would prove as dramatic and as conflicted as the man himself. At first, his sister Elizabeth became the gatekeeper. She gathered his manuscripts, edited his fragments, and published a distorted compilation she called The Will to Power. In doing so, she turned her brother's complex, restless thought into something tidy, something usable for her own ambitions. Elizabeth was deeply nationalistic, sympathetic to authoritarian currents in Germany, and she painted Nietzsche as a prophet of German greatness. Where he had despised anti-Semitism, she inserted it. Where he had mocked nationalism, she twisted him into its patron saint. The result was a Nietzsche who would have horrified Nietzsche. This distortion reached its darkest moment in the 1930s and 40s. The Nazis paraded his name, quoted his phrases, and displayed his image as if he were one of their own. Hitler himself attended Elizabeth's funeral in 1935, standing before Nietzsche's works as if consecrating them to his cause. The irony was devastating. The philosopher who scorned obedience and herd mentality was recast as the prophet of the herd itself. God is dead was reshaped into the Führer is God. It was one of the most violent misuses of philosophy in modern history. And yet, Nietzsche did not vanish under that shadow. After the war, scholars, artists, and thinkers began to reclaim him. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus found in him the courage to confront a meaningless world and still create. Psychologists like Carl Jung and Alfred Adler saw in him insights into archetypes, power, and the hidden forces of the psyche. Martin Heidegger dedicated volumes to him, calling him the last great metaphysician. Even in literature and art, his fingerprints are everywhere, in Thomas Mann's novels, in Gustav Mahler's symphonies, in the raw rebellion of modernism itself. Nietzsche's legacy is a battlefield. On one side, the idols who tried to chain him to ideologies he despised. On the other, the free spirits who heard his laughter and his challenge to create life anew. He is claimed by atheists and mystics, by anarchists and conservatives, by psychologists and poets. Few thinkers have been so violently misread, and yet so enduringly alive. To read him is to face a mirror that does not flatter. He does not tell you what to believe, he strips belief bare. He does not soothe, he demands. And perhaps that is why he continues to matter, because his philosophy is not comfortable, but it is urgent. The man who collapsed into silence in 1889 could never have known that his voice would echo into the 20th and 21st centuries, not as doctrine, but as provocation. His books survive like dynamite left in the soil, dangerous, unstable, ready to explode in the hands of anyone willing to strike the fuse. Nietzsche's shadow reached far beyond philosophy classrooms. In the cafes of Paris, painters and poets quoted him as they tore down the rules of old art. In Russia, Dostoevsky's heirs read him as a fellow traveler into the dark night of the soul. In America, the beat poets carried fragments of his thunder into smoky bars and restless cities. Every generation seemed to find a different Nietzsche, prophet, destroyer, liberator, madman. What unites them is the spark. His thought is not a system you can memorize, it is a fire you risk touching. Some burn their hands and turn away. Others take the flame and light their own path. That is why, a century later, his voice is still not settled, still debated, still dangerous. Nietzsche is not a monument. He is a question, and questions do not die. And so the story closes. Nietzsche's body lies in Weimar, but his words wander still. He sought truth and found silence. He chased meaning and embraced chaos. He fell into madness yet left behind visions that still unsettle and inspire. In the end, his life is both a warning and a spark. A warning of how fragile the human vessel can be, and a spark that shows how one voice, even from the edge of collapse, can ignite centuries.
Nietzsche fell silent, but his words never did. And if you have come this far, maybe you, too, have heard the laughter in the abyss. Good night.